Okay, you dirtbags, you wannabe dirtbags, you poser dirtbags, you pretend dirtbags. This episode is for you because it is all about dirt, or to be more accurate, it's about soil, which is very different from dirt. And we are going to learn about that. And do not be afraid of that word learn. This is going to be a really fun episode. And I'm so excited because we are talking to Dr. Kristina Young of Science Moab, who is one of my absolute heroes for the work that she is doing, teaching people to be excited about the desert and what a really miraculous, life-filled world it is. With me, rocking his West Marine hat, is Justin. Oh, I'm sorry, Justin. Does that say West Marine or West Marin?
West Marin.
West Marin. Sorry. Yeah. Well, enough about Justin. Let's get to our guest today because she's way more interesting, exciting, smarter, and eloquent than the two of us put together. Dr. Kristina Young, Science Moab. Hi.
Hi. Joy to be here with you.
I'm so excited. Okay. So without preamble, let's just dive in and you tell us just a little bit about yourself and then we'll take it off from there.
Sure. Yeah, I am so excited to be here and to talk to everybody about soil and dirt and all of these good things. I am a scientist. I live in Moab. I've lived here for the last 10 years and I am absolutely in love with this landscape and I love learning about it and I love talking about it, and kind of all that I do kind of revolves around those things, trying to understand this place and get people as excited about it as I am. So yeah, that's who I am.
Awesome. So what is your doctorate technically in?
Yeah, I got my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, specifically focusing on studying biological soil crusts. So these biocrusts that we have in Moab and in deserts around the world. And I studied how they interact with the rest of the landscape. So this soil layer and how it interacts with plants and all of these other components of the ecosystem.
How everything's connected.
Exactly, how everything's connected.
Okay. So the reason that we're doing this now is because the week that we're recording this, a film just dropped by a couple of folks who I'm great fans, one of whom is a good friend of mine, another of whom we're not friends yet, but we have images of him actually running in the summer issue. So Sinway Xavier and John Watson, who you know from The Rativist, the three of you just created a movie about you and your work, and we're going to talk at length about that because the timing on this is great. But the first question I really want to ask you is, how did you fall in love with the desert? And where are you from originally? When did you come there? And how did you fall in love with it?
Sure. So I grew up in New Jersey. I was actually born in New York City, in Manhattan, downtown New York. And I grew up in a very urban area. So I was completely surrounded by concrete, didn't really spend a lot of time outdoors growing up at all. And so that was kind of the childhood. I mean, it was great. I got exposed to a lot of really interesting cultural things growing up where I did. But, somewhere in my teens, I started actually consuming media, like seeing movies about, these mountains and these outdoor places. And I was super fascinated by these expansive landscapes that I'd never really gotten to see growing up. And so I decided to kind of change things up pretty dramatically from my childhood, and I decided to go to college in Montana. So I left Jersey and sight unseen moved to Missoula, Montana, and started getting exposed to adventure and the outdoor world, and started meeting people who had all of this passion for these incredible places that I didn't know anything about. And so I got really excited about kind of seeing the natural world really for the first time as an 18-year-old. And I started learning about all of these really interesting things around me that I really had never really known anything about. So I started seeing plants for the first time, understanding that, all of these different places had different communities of living things that were growing in them. I just didn't really know that kind of stuff. And so I started to really get excited by understanding these interactions of the landscape and the plants and the animals and everything that you see around you. And I thought it was so interesting that all of these things are able to kind of live together and coexist. And then one year, like so many people do from Montana, I went down to Moab for spring break. I got invited on this trip. I was like, sure, where's Moab? That sounds fun. And so I drove down here, and it just absolutely blew me away because, I'd gotten really into this learning of the world around me and these mountain systems and these forests. And then all of a sudden I came to the exact opposite place where there were no trees and there was, very few shrubs spaced out. And then there was these super weird living communities in between all of these plants. And I was just absolutely enthralled. I mean, it was just so interesting and so beautiful. And so like nothing I'd ever really seen or known anything about. And I just wanted to learn more. So I actually dropped out of college and I moved down to the Southwest just to be here. And I got a job at the Grand Canyon and I worked there and just have been kind of studying that ever since.
Wow.
I have a question. Now, before you laugh, microclimates are weird. Okay. So we know this, that there can be weird things in weird places, but I've never actually given this any thought before. Do you know, are there any little pockets of desert, like anywhere at all, like east of the Mississippi, like little ones that maybe people don't know about? I don't know where they would be. I've never seen one, but it just occurred to me now, you being from the East Coast, like maybe you tried to find, maybe, because you obviously love deserts. Maybe you tried to find like the, unknown ones. I don't know. Are there any?
I love that question. So deserts are, when you define a desert, you're talking about a climate regime, right? So you're talking about like a bigger picture thing. So there aren't deserts in the way that like scientists talk about them, right, on the East Coast, because it's just too wet. There's just too much rainfall. Are there pockets of dry places on the East Coast? Absolutely. And the places actually where they exist, where you can actually find Biocrust on the eastern part of the country is an areas like ocean, like sand dunes near the ocean. You get these really dry. You can actually get prickly pear cactus in New Jersey. Since learning all that I have, I've gone back and started seeing these things. The Great Lakes, similar, you get these really cool sand dune ecosystems. The Pine Barrens, kind of in the East Coast too, you get some really dry, really interesting, like you said, microclimate habitats that have these really cool desert-like communities that live in them, but they're not actually considered true deserts. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad I asked.
Although much of the East Coast is a Mexican food desert, I will say that.
100%.
So good
Yeah,
luck
that's actually what I meant. Yeah,
Good luck finding really hot salsa there. Before we drill down, let's start a little bit at a higher level. And the deserts, the world's deserts are found in bands for specific reasons. And deserts are commonly rain shadow deserts. And so tell us a little bit about how deserts form, and then maybe use that, if you don't mind, of an entry into misperceptions about deserts. Because I think one of the big misperceptions is that they are lifeless, that they are desolate, and they are anything but. So yeah, can you give us that macro view and then start to drill down?
Totally. Yeah. I love these big picture questions about deserts. So, we often categorize these kind of dry places of the world and we call them dry lands. So these are dry lands, kind of are this category that areas that have a limited amount of rainfall and a lot of evaporative demand from the atmosphere are called drylands. So I'll break down what that means. So this idea that, you don't get a lot of rain, and the rain that you do get, the rain that's able to come and kind of be in the soil is easily sucked out of the soil because the air is so dry, right? So that is what we call a dryland. And so drylands are actually one of the Earth's largest biomes. So over 40% of the Earth's land surface is made up of a dryland, which is insane. That's a huge amount of land. And these are areas that we don't often think about when we think about important land types in kind of Earth's ecosystems, right? People love talking about forests and mountains and tropics, but actually these dry places cover the majority of the Earth's surface. And so there's so many important things to know about them. And so, yeah, just like you said, drylands can occur because of rain shadows. So you think of like the Tibetan Plateau, and then you have this huge expanse of drylands on the kind of dry side of that area. You also get them because of these like large scale circulation currents of kind of, moisture being sucked up from the ocean and then moving in these large patterns. And so then you get these areas where you get a flood of moisture from the atmosphere. And then as it kind of descends back towards the equator, the air is drier. And so you have this drying effect of the atmosphere, and that dries out the land. And so drylands are just this, large scale part of Earth systems. They're natural. They're these really cool combination of different factors of the Earth system that make drylands dry. They're not all hot, right? Antarctica has drylands. Those are cold deserts. The Colorado Plateau where I am, this is a dryland, and we freeze every year. And then you do get, you get your very classic ideas of drylands like the Sahara Desert, where you have, sand dunes and very dry climate. And so drylands encompass all of those things. Deserts typically are like the driest of the dry. So we often talk about them as like aridity. So the more arid, the more deserty, and the less arid, the kind of, we call it like a semi-arid dryland. So the Colorado Plateau is semi-arid. It's not like crazy, super hot, but it's this, still a component of a dryland ecosystem. And so, yeah, drylands are expansive. They're really interesting, and they're really underloved. And so there's a lot of misperceptions about what drylands are and how people think about them. How was that long-winded explanation?
It's great. It's awesome. As somebody who I spent the early part of my career really in the mountains and in love with the mountains, and through trips across the West, fell in love with the desert, and now I'm planting roots there. And so my journey has been one of kind of my eyes progressively opening to what's there. And I still remember I got a job at Powder Magazine. I moved from Vermont to Southern California. And then 2 days later, we drove across the Mojave to Las Vegas for a skiing trade show. And I still remember going across through like Barstow and Baker, and that whole area. And it's just, my eyes were just wide open, going, oh my God, it's huge, and there's nothing here. And the Mojave is not a particularly overtly classically pretty desert. It's kind of scrubby. Now I think it's beautiful, but at the time I was like, oh my God, it's just like, I did feel like I'd dropped into a mountainous Sahara Desert. So, and it has been amazing to learn just how much is there, and not just how much is there, but how finely calibrated lives are there, and that I think is what is kind of mind blowing and really eye opening to a lot of people, just how much life there is there. So let's talk about the living soil and Biocrust and why you guys made this film.
Yeah, I really like the point you just made, because it's life there. Life in dry places is really understated, right? And so you really need to know where to look for it. You need to know what times of year to look for it. It can be really inconsistent. Like, the Mojave is famous for super blooms. So, you don't see anything there for a super long time. And then all of a sudden you realize what these landscapes are capable of. And so just like with, these beautiful flowers that can come up, there are also these like super cool communities that live right at the soil surface, called those biological soil crusts, that live in all deserts, all drylands across the globe. And so we were really excited to make a movie getting people psyched on seeing and understanding the dynamics of the biocrusts that exist in these cool places.
So let me interrupt you for just 1 second. I'm guessing most people think about soil as dirt, and maybe they know there's some bacteria there, but this idea that soil is living, I think, is snap a few beans. So, what is Biocrust? Is it cryptogamic soil, cryptobiotic? Is it like, give us a little bit of a definition here, and how in the world can soil have living components?
Totally. So in dry places, right, like one of the overarching characteristics is that they're really dry, right? Go figure. And so when there's a limitation of water, plants can't be all close together. They just can't, because they're going to run out of moisture. They're not going to be able to grow. So they can't look like your lawn, right? They can't be a continuous covering. There's plants are spaced out in the desert. Everybody could picture that. And in these places, there was all this kind of open space on the soil surface. And what ended up evolving to fill that space are these really cool communities of biological soil crust organisms. And they're there because there was space for them to be there. And so they take advantage of that, and they grow on the soil surface in deserts. And so biocrust, just like you said, cryptogamic crusts, lots of people call them lots of different things. They're kind of growing right at the soil surface in between plants in dry places. And there are these really interesting dynamic communities that have cyanobacteria and lichens and mosses and tardigrades and microfauna and little organisms that you can only see under a microscope. And so there are these really complex communities of living things that are just right at the soil surface. And we talk about them as kind of holding the soil together, because the way that they kind of anchor onto the soil is they actually kind of grow around the sand grains, like right at the desert soil surface, and really kind of get their foothold that way. And so that's how soil can be alive, is that there are all these organisms that are literally kind of wound around the soil particles in desert regions. And so that is kind of what Biocrust is and what it's doing on the soil surface.
So they're kind of physically knit together, but do they have symbiotic relationships with one another the way trees do with fungi?
Totally. I mean, they're all interacting. It's really just like an ecosystem in miniature, right? So when you think of forests and all the different dynamics that are going on in a forest, you could say very similar things about the biological soil crust. So some of the components of biocrust, like the cyanobacteria, are leaking out things like carbon and nutrients, and then other bacteria are eating those, and then other organisms are eating the bacteria, and there are viruses, and it's a really incredibly dynamic little system, and it's like 2 centimeters tall, right? It's really shallow, but there's so much going on in them. And so that's what makes them so interesting, is you don't think of this really cool dynamic system in the deserts, but they're right there. They're right there at the soil surface.
Can you talk about how they form? I mean, what is like which of those elements is there first? And like whether, and I mean, I'm actually interested in this sort of evolutionarily as well. Like if I don't know if like Biocrust fossilizes, so like I don't know how much it's changed over eons, but just generally speaking, I know it takes forever for new Biocrust to form. But what's just the first element to sort of colonize the soil?
Yeah, fantastic question. So Biocrust is the OG evolutionarily, right? So before vascular plants, so vascular plants meaning just like plants with roots, before they evolved, the land was covered in biocrust. And so really we had a biocrust earth, and then plants came and got in the way. And so biocrust would be everywhere if it were not for the fact that plants evolved and kind of outcompeted the biocrust for space. That's why they exist in deserts. If plants just suddenly disappeared, the whole world would go back to being covered in biocrust, which is pretty cool to think about. And so in these dry places where biocrust still, has a foothold, typically the first thing that kind of colonizes maybe an area has been super disturbed, there's no more biocrust there. And so the first thing that's going to kind of come back are the cyanobacteria, which are kind of photosynthetic organisms, so bacteria that get their energy from the sun, and they are going to come and kind of create this stabilized surface that other organisms can grow on. So the cyanobacteria, they're so cool and so beautiful looking when you look at them under a microscope. They have these long filaments that they kind of have these really kind of long bacterial bodies that are able to wind around soil sand grains. And so they actually secrete this really sticky glue out of their bodies that like anchor the soil together. And so they create this platform for other organisms to come in and start growing, because most other things in Biocrust can't really get a foothold until the soil is relatively stable, and the cyanobacteria and their sticky goo are the things that are really doing that stabilization. And so from there, you start getting more complex communities. You start getting mosses and lichens and other types of bacteria that are able to develop. And so it's a pretty cool process. You know, people, you could kind of think of it like in the same way as like if you cut down a forest, like things start coming back in a specific way. The same thing is true with Biocrust. They're just like other ecological communities. They're just smaller.
How old can it be? Like a mature Biocrust? Like how long does this live?
It's a great question. It's with a kind of not straightforward answer, in that like these organisms are constantly like regenerating themselves, you know? So like they're some of them are singular cellular, right? They're teeny tiny, and so they're constantly turning over. And so you're never like looking at one Biocrust and being like, that's the same exact organism that was there, you know, however many years ago. And so it's kind of a tricky question, because the whole community is constantly turning over. But they can be on a landscape in perpetuity, right? There's no, they can hang out and keep living and keep growing and dying and kind of changing over, just like any other ecosystem type if they're not disturbed. One of the coolest things about Biocrust is all of the organisms in Biocrust are what we call desiccation tolerant, which all of that means is that they're able to go dormant when they're dry. So they just kind of like hang out and don't really do much and don't really need to eat or take in nutrients or, you know, do their photosynthesis. They just go completely dormant when they're dry. And that allows them to persist in these dry places for a really long time. And so they can be in this dormant state, in this desiccated state, for like potentially tens to hundreds of years, and just straight hang until water comes. And so that allows them to persist on a landscape for like a really long time.
That's so rad. So we're not recording video on this anymore, just audio. So I kind of wish we were, because Kristina's her hand gestures of how she's like knitting together the soil, and I've never seen somebody with a bigger smile talking about dirt. So if you get a chance to hear
my toddlers also.
Well, that's true. Yeah, yes. That's true. Olivia and Harper are they're kind of right up there.
They're dirt scientists as well.
The reason I asked about the age is because it takes a long time to mature, right? And I've seen Biocrust that's more than an inch and a half tall, which is that's a mature old ecosystem, right? And one footprint, like these filaments are very fragile, correct? Like a footprint can crush this, and it would take like how long? I mean, like a long, long time, right? For it to reestablish itself in that spot.
You know, living in Moab for so long, locals love to come up to me and they're like, I stepped on a patch of Biocrust 2 years ago, and now I don't see my footprint anymore. And you told me it takes 1,000 years for Biocrust to come back. And then they kind of tell me that they tell me that I'm all fake news and stuff. And so, I tell that story to kind of illustrate that it's actually complicated. And so I'll start by saying, like, don't step on Biocrust. Like, that's the number one thing, because yes, they are fragile, but the recovery of Biocrust is really context dependent. And this matters because if we think of it as this thing that, like, once you disturb it, it's gone forever, or it's going to take thousands of years, then we don't want to put effort into trying to restore it, but we should, and we can, and we do. And so thinking about it maybe a little bit more in a nuanced way is really helpful, and thinking about how we interact with Biocrust. And so just like anything else in the desert, things are slow to grow always, right? Like there's just not a lot of water here, and water is life. And so, if there's a really wet year, or multiple wet years in a row, Biocrust can actually recover relatively quickly. You can get, with the right conditions, you can get Biocrust to start growing on a landscape. The majority of growth on the Colorado Plateau of Biocrust actually occurs in the winter and often occurs underneath snow, which is so cool. And so we want to keep snow happening every year on the Colorado Plateau because it's really when Biocrusts are able to grow. And so, if it's a really great few wet years, Biocrust can recover relatively quickly. Like if you did step on some Biocrust again, don't do that. You would probably, not really see your footprint again. And within if you had a bunch of wet years in a row, 5 years. If you drove a car or camped on a big section of Biocrust, that's a bigger disturbance. That's going to take a lot longer to recover than a single footprint.
Well, one thing that's really clear about Biocrust is that it's complicated and it's nuanced. There's just so much more going on here. It seemed pretty simple. You step on it and you killed it. It's going to take 10,000 years to recover, but there's more to it than that. And when we first were getting ready to record, we sort of joked with Kristina that a typical podcast session is usually 4 to 6 hours. Honestly, I think I could spend 4 to 6 hours talking about Biocrust and all this, because it's man, if you've ever been down on your hands and knees, eye level with it, and thinking about this community could be hundreds or thousands of years old when you just thought it was dirt. It really does sort of blow the mind. So we're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, we're gonna talk about why these soils, these biological soils, matter and how we restore them. We will be right back after this break. You love adventure, we love adventure, and that is why we created Adventure Journal in print. It is the gift that we've made for ourselves and for our friends and hopefully for you that is analog, that gets away from screens, that gives you some of the most interesting, deepest, and thoughtful stories from some of the best writers and photographers working in the outdoor space. We do 4 a year. You get free shipping and a deep discount. It's $60 to have this absolutely beautiful, no batteries necessary celebration of adventure in your mailbox. Get it at adventure-journal.com. I am drinking, it's gotten cold now because we're halfway through the show. I am drinking Long Weekend Coffee. We launched Long Weekend Coffee earlier this year to bring you and us blends that are not fussy, that will take any kind of brew method that we like, whether it's at home, in a cabin, on the tailgate of a truck, doesn't matter. We have 4 blends. We have dark, medium, espresso roast, and a decaf. I think they're pretty amazing. I guarantee you will like them. Check us out at longweekend.coffee. All right, welcome back. We are talking with Dr. Kristina Young, the executive director, I believe still, and founder of Science Moab in the wonderful state of Utah. And Justin Hausman, my co-host, had not spent much time in the desert, and I took him on a road trip to Cedar Mesa, and we saw some amazing archaeology, and he was introduced to biological soils for the first time, coming from the lush paradise that is Fairfax, California, in Marin County.
We don't have
It was all new
Biocrust.
to him. You don't have Biocrust that we know of, although Kristina maybe
Yeah,
tell
good
us
point.
that we did. Yeah,
Yeah,
she's nodding.
probably,
Yeah,
we
you
probably
do.
do actually. Yeah.
You're stepping on it. You probably built your house on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was your first intro to what'd you think?
It was. So what was interesting is, I don't remember if I had written the article about it for AJ before that trip or not, but I remember you telling me that I'm going to show you this incredible soil. It's super fragile, step lightly, all that sort of stuff. But I mean, I would have no idea what it looked like without you pointing it out to me. So I mean, there's going to be obviously there's a lot of people that visit Utah or deserts generally speaking who won't have listened to this podcast or don't know what Biocrust is and are just going to be traipsing everywhere trying to find a good photo. But can you talk a little bit about what it looks like and how somebody can recognize it that's never been to the desert before?
Totally. So Biocrust looks different in different places. And so I'll talk a little bit about what it looks like in Moab. But just as like the main thing to remember is the best thing you can do is always just assume it's there, right? If you don't know what it looks like, and if you've heard about this fancy dirt on the soil surface and that you're supposed to stay on trail, just do it. And then, and then slowly learn how to recognize it as opposed to accidentally stepping on it because you didn't realize. So the way you can kind of tell when biocrust is there is because you can kind of see like a texture on the soil surface. So if it's like, a sandy soil, but it's not just like loose sand, like a sand dune or, like a sand pit. You can kind of see that the soil is being held together a little bit, that if you were to like press on it, it'd be like a little bit hard. And so that is evidence of biocrusts. And so that would be like, biocrust, like a cyanobacteria biocrust covering the soil surface. Other biocrusts are going to start to look, at least on the Colorado Plateau, they're going to start to look like pinnacled is what we call it. So like kind of like mountainous almost, but like we're talking, a few centimeters tall. We're not talking, we're talking like at a very micro scale, but definitely noticeable, right? So you get these kind of like pinnacles within the biocrust, and then you start noticing other cool, interesting textures and colors. And so those are the different organisms. Those are mosses and lichens that are growing here on the Colorado Plateau. If biocrust hasn't been disturbed in a while, it'll start getting like a darker color on it. So it'll look kind of like black. And so then you can really start noticing it. And if you've ever been to the visitor center or, seen pictures of biocrust, that's typically the kind of biocrust you'll see. And what that is it's actually super interesting. So it's the cyanobacteria in the biocrust are actually creating these pigments in their bodies that are working as sunscreens. So the biocrust creates its own sunscreen to protect itself from UV radiation. It's so cool. So that's what, when you see that, you're like, bomber biocrust. Definitely don't step there. Really cool to see.
That's amazing. That just blows my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. It's an incredible adaptation to dry places, right? They're stuck on the soil surface. They're just like glued there. They can't move away from the sun on really hot days. And so they evolved pigments to protect their cells.
What about the other colors? I mean, in the film, by the way, which you can find on the Radivist, Radivist.com, is called From Biocrust with Love. And some of the footage is just incredible, but it can be multicolored. What are those colors and what's the source of them?
Yeah, so that dark color, like I said, is the cyanobacteria. A lot of the other colors, there are these beautiful pinks and like these baby blues and some yellow. That is all lichens, and similarly photoprotective, so protective from sunlight pigmentation to keep their cells from just getting totally rocked by the sunlight that's almost continuous here in the desert. There are also mosses, that are kind of brown or black when they're dry, but when they get wet, they turn beautiful green colors, really bright green. And so just like I was describing earlier, these are desiccation tolerant organisms. So they're dormant when they're dry and they're shriveled and they're not very colorful, but when they get wet, they kind of really come alive, they unfurl, they start photosynthesizing, and that's when you really get the vibrancy of the colors. And so it's always, always a treat to be here after a rain, because that's when you really get to appreciate like the depth of beauty of these really cool organisms. In very, very special circumstances where you get enough water and you get the right type of sunlight, the soil surface where maybe you wouldn't have thought there was biocrusts that kind of just looks like sand turns almost like a carpet of green. And that's because so many of the cyanobacteria filaments are right at the soil surface photosynthesizing, and you can just see it. It's like a covering. It's so cool. I've seen it like in 10 years, like 4 times. So it's really rare, but it's incredible to see. It gives you appreciation of how much is out there.
How do they handle a strong rain? I mean, do they drown? Do they get pushed off the soil during like a monsoonal downpour, or do they love that?
They love it. They're psyched. And so they're able to kind of like swell up and kind of take in water, and then they kind of get we call them like gelatinous, so like squishy and stuff. And then water is able to just kind of percolate through. And there's all that sticky goo that they are able to exert. They're really strong. They're really strong horizontally, right? So runoff, water moving over them, hitting them, they can withstand it. They're very weak vertically, right? They're very weak to like strong compression forces like your footprint, but they're very, very strong horizontally.
So obviously, beautiful, fascinating, endlessly interesting, long living, takes forever for them to come back. But not why should we care, but what do they do? Like, what is the importance of a biocrust to a desert, or even to regions around the desert? Maybe they have impact on areas that aren't even part of the desert. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Totally. So, like I was describing, biocrusts kind of wind their way around sand grains right in the desert. And without them there, if they aren't there to hold those sand grains together, there is nothing else. The plants are spaced far apart. There's no other way for the sand to kind of remain intact. And so what happens without the covering of biocrusts is that wind and water just move soil, sediment, sand grains out of an area. And so it starts causing this cascading effect of erosion. And, there's so many consequences that come with kind of runaway erosion, and that is dust that you get in the atmosphere, and that's like sediment loading into rivers and channels, and that's all because things like the biocrusts are not there to continue to hold the desert in place. And so that is really the main reason why we care about biocrusts, other than the obviousness that they're the coolest thing around. And so these areas, especially the American Southwest, are not historically dusty places. Some deserts are dusty, like the Sahara Desert, like those big sand dunes. Yeah, that's going to be a dusty place. But the types of deserts we have in the Southwest, the type of desert that the Colorado Plateau is not an inherently dusty ecosystem. It's the loss of biocrust and then the loss of plants. So that feedback of once you start erosion, it's a very hard process to stop. And so once that sand gets exposed to the crazy spring winds, anybody who's adventured in Moab in the springtime knows how intense the winds are here. When the biocrust is disturbed, all of that sediment is becoming airborne. Large amounts of that sediment are becoming airborne, and that's causing a lot of the dust problems that we're seeing in the region. Dust is an accelerating and like pretty serious problem that we're having across the Southwest.
How is that a problem? What is it doing?
Yeah.
I know it gets on snowpack.
Totally,
it increases.
It gets in your
Yeah. So why is dust a problem?
Yeah, other than being incredibly unpleasant, if you're
Yeah.
out camping, it's in your eyes, it's in your teeth, it's in your food. Has real impacts on human health. And so there are actually fungus and other living things in the soil that once they kind of become in the air, you breathe them in, and that's not good for your lungs at all. It's actually a pretty serious health risk when at the scale at which it's occurring. It also can cause, a lot of problems with visibility. And so there are actually a lot of fatalities on highways because of dust storms, because of this, airborne dust moving. And then, people come to Moab and these places to look at the views. And if it's a dusty day, you don't get to see, I can't see the LaSalles sometimes from my house because the dust can be so bad. And then, there are these even bigger regional impacts of the dust. And so the dust is getting picked up from, the Southwest, the Colorado Plateau, the Four Corners area, and it's moving in the predominant wind direction. And so here the wind moves kind of from the Southwest, and then it moves eastward. And so the dust is in the atmosphere, and the first thing that it kind of hits as it's moving east is the Rocky Mountains. And so the dust in the air is kind of hitting against the Rockies and then just kind of dropping onto the snowpack that we have there. And so the spring winds pushing dust, landing on snow in the Rockies. And what that's doing is that's changing the color of the snow. And so maybe people have heard about this dust on snow phenomenon that's happening in the Wasatch and the Rockies. It's happening all across the Intermountain West. And it's a result of disturbance in the desert, releasing dust, and then the snow is a darker color, and that darker color snow causes the snow to melt faster because the sunlight and the energy from the sun is hitting now a darker colored surface, and the snow is melting. And so that's a really big issue for our region, for anybody who cares about snow or water, which is basically all of us.
I was in southern France many years ago skiing, carrying the flag for powder. And there was a wind event from North Africa across the Mediterranean, and the snow was kind of yellow. And I think it was less than a week ago, there was a huge wind event, right, that carried dust from the Sahara to Greece. Was it? I think you were posting about it, Kristina.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nuanced story because the transportation of dust globally is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So like Sahara dust actually sometimes can be an important phosphorus source for the tropics, right? So like these large scale processes that are happening are not necessarily all bad or good. It's when humans muck around with stuff too much and kind of change the natural levels of dust. So the Sahara dust hitting Europe is not, an abnormal phenomena. It's the scale and the scope of the process that's increasing. So dust is increasing globally because of human disturbances. That's not just recreation, right? We're talking all types of disturbances. And so dust inherently bad? No, dust is part of the world. Too much dust because the land, these dry places get disturbed, the biocrust and plants get disturbed, and dust is able to get kicked up. That is the problem that we're concerned about and thinking about addressing.
Speaking of disturbances, one of my least favorite disturbances creatures are cows and grazing in the West, for a whole bunch of reasons. And I'm wondering if that's a more complicated story than it seems to me, because it to me, I look at it and I'm like, cows bad, period, because I've seen them trash the soil. I've seen them create dust. I've seen them absolutely thrash, potholes and watering holes and creating new trails. Tell us about the role of grazing in the West and its impact on Biocrust.
Totally. Unsustainable grazing is unsustainable. Always, full stop. You can't ask more of these ecosystems than they can offer, right? So there's dry places have an inherent limit to what they can produce. And so if you're grazing beyond that limit, you are gonna tank an ecosystem. That's just what happens. And when you combine it with the immense amount of climate variability year to year, some years it doesn't really rain and some years it rains a lot, and so with that type of inconsistency, it's very hard to sustainably graze an area without accidentally overgrazing. Anything that disrupts the soil surface, like cow hooves, is going to disrupt biocrust, right? It's going to break biocrust up. The issues become, like the number of head of cattle, the type of year, the exact location and the timing of grazing, and the type of cattle themselves. So like there are these initiatives in the Southwest to try to bring in more smaller bodied, larger dispersing types of cattle that aren't, your typical European Angus cattle in the Southwest, thinking about adaptation strategies. Globally, pastoralism and grazing is a livelihood for a lot of people. And so to writ large be like grazing in dry places is bad is not something that we want to do, because pastoralists have evolved with dry places for millennia, for large portions of human history. And so the problem becomes when the grazing pressures, the economic drivers, and the social factors are not aligned with the realities of the landscape. And these might be cop-out sciencey answers, but they're actually true, right? Like it's complicated, and understanding kind of the potential of a landscape and the variability that exists within like how much forage can exist in a given year is kind of the thing to understand about grazing in the
I don't
Southwest
buy it. Cows are
specifically.
bad. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. It's not fake news. It's not fake. It is always, it's always complicated.
Yeah. And there's definitely, I mean, here's the thing, right? I think a lot of people don't understand how degraded a lot of the Southwest already is. And that was because of insanely overgrazed patterns in like the 1880s, right? So when people first, when, you know, colonization was really happening and people were moving out west with these huge head of cattle and sheep, they severely degraded the landscape. So all of the many of the arroyos that you see and like many of the landscape features are a result, they're not like inherent to this place, they're a result of like insane overgrazing historically. And so these systems are still in a period of recovery. The head of cattle on the landscape right now is much, much less, but we have so much work to do to try to restore the areas that were so horribly degraded in the past 150 years.
So I've sort of two questions. One, I'm curious if biocrusts are protected, if they can be. If I don't know if we could, if it's like whether it's keeping cattle out or some other ways that government agencies try to protect it. But also, in addition to that, since it is such a slow growing and fragile, ecosystem, what can be done to help restore it?
Totally. Yeah. So not busting the crust is a way to protect biocrust, right? And so there are a lot of different land uses that are happening. There's a lot of demands on the landscapes, especially on the Colorado Plateau around Moab. And so not disturbing biocrust is pretty important. And people are doing that. People are really recognizing the message is getting out. Addressing climate change is also very important. All of these issues are interconnected. Climate change is definitely affecting biocrust cover. And so addressing climate change at a policy global scale is pretty important, pretty cool thing we can do to, protect biocrust. And then the thing that I've worked on a lot that I'm really excited about is biocrust restoration. And so we were talking about how long biocrust takes to grow. It does take a long time. I don't want to give the impression that it doesn't, but it's faster than we had typically thought about in the past. And there are things that we can do to aid that recovery, to speed that recovery up. So for example, I got to work in Bandelier National Monument in New Mexico, and I went out and collected a little bit of biocrust, and I was able to take that little bit of biocrust that we collected and grow it out in the greenhouse. And I was able to grow full communities of biocrust in 4 months with the right combination of water and nutrients and sunlight. And so these are not inherently slow growing organisms. It's the environment that causes them to grow slowly. And so if we can kind of start producing biocrust at larger scales, we can start putting it back onto the landscape and, figuring out ways to kind of address a lot of those, what I think are actually very addressable problems. Soil erosion is not inevitable. We can put biocrust back on the landscape. We can work on not disturbing areas at large scale so that the biocrust can get a chance, and again, it can recover if left alone. It's not going to be 10 million years, right? Like the policy management plans, human recreation actions that do not rebust the crust are really important. And so people recognizing that, again, like just assume biocrust is everywhere, and then that'll be a great part of the solution. Just don't.
That's a great message, because I always figured, oops, oh crap, it's done, and knowing that it's, not done. And has it successfully been transplanted from, lab grown or greenhouse grown into the desert and
Totally.
it does.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, it takes work. Again, it's like the climate is challenging. And so we have to water or do all these different, things. So it's not just like you can sprinkle it, but it can be transplanted. Actually, China is leading the world in biocrust restoration at scale. And so this is not just like a niche Moab thing, right? Like this is like people around the world are working on these issues of biocrust, recognizing its importance in soil stabilization. And so, yeah, it can totally happen. People are like at Arches National Park and Canyonlands, they're starting to take biocrust out of areas where they're gonna where they need to put in a new parking lot or whatever.
Oh, wow.
Unfortunately, they take the biocrust out first, they go and collect it, on like cookie sheets, and then they move it, and then they use that same biocrust, we call it inoculum, to then put it back somewhere else that has been disturbed. And so there are all these things that we can do, and there's tons of scientists and all types of different people at different levels working on thinking about biocrust restoration.
Can we teach the cows to not walk on the biocrust? Is that
great question?
Maybe can we teach the ranchers?
Nobody's told them. They don't know. They're out there just trying to make, trying to get a.
We actually can, because one thing that a lot of ranchers have been working on is called virtual fencing. And so this idea that you no longer have to build fences on the landscape, but you have these collars where you could set boundaries with which cattle can go. And so if there has been an area that was heavily disturbed and you want to let that biocrust recover, you can fence that area out so your cattle can't go there. So yes, we can teach them.
That's amazing. How are the costs compared to fencing, and is there government support to help? I know
there's a ton of programs. The USDA is working on a lot of programs. They're doing it with researchers who are studying biocrust, who recognize the interconnectedness of these, multi-use ecosystems, and are trying to actually find solutions. And so, the costs are comparable. Building fences takes a long time. Now, ranchers can just look at where their cows are in the landscape and then just go right out to them. The solutions are there. It's just the will. It's the social and political and economic will to make it happen.
That seems like something that everybody could be down with, though. That's not like a wolf restoration thing. It seems like that's something that theoretically wouldn't be politicized, but who knows?
No, people are into it. It's just making it happen.
So how would you assess the level of knowledge of visitors coming to Moab about this? I know that there's been a lot of work to educate people, but do people who come to Moab, do they understand? Do they get it? Do they get it quickly? Yeah.
Yeah, it all varies. Of course, from person to person. I think sometimes we have a lot of trouble communicating biocrust to our international audiences, especially people who maybe don't speak English and can't necessarily read the signs that are trying to describe biocrust. But for the most part, more and more people are really understanding, biocrust and what it's doing in the ecosystem. The parks, the trail ambassadors, so many people around Moab are trying to get the message out. The organization that I'm a part of, Science Moab, is trying to do a ton of things to get people to kind of understand the importance of biocrust and the fragility of deserts at scale. And so one method that we use is that we're training outdoor recreation guides, so raft guides and bike guides and climbing guides, how to effectively communicate information about biocrust to visitors. It's not always natural to just try to get people excited about microorganisms, and so how do you tell a story about biocrust that people can relate to? How do you find an in? If a visitor is a skier, the way that you might want to talk about biocrust is through dust on snow, telling them that their sweet pal might not be there because it's going to melt earlier, and the reason for that is this biocrust that's being disturbed right where we are. So finding different ways to get people excited and have it relate to them in their lives is really a huge effort that Science Moab is working on with the Science Certified Guide program. That's really cool. How long does it take to go through the certification? We work with company owners, actually, and so we spend a whole day out with guides, and we teach them how to talk about biocrust, how to talk about the complexity of desert ecosystems, how to talk about geology in these ways that their clients can relate to, and that's fun and interesting, and that will hopefully resonate on a personal level. And so we usually work with guide companies, and so if you're a guide and you want to be a part of this, tell your company that you want to get science certified, and we can set up a training and get everybody psyched. It increases tips, it makes the companies look good, it helps everybody in Moab kind of be part of this movement of sustainably recreating. Do you feel like there's more of an acceptance for sciencey things now, especially in the part of recreation? It seems like, I don't know, does it seem like this public is more into sciencey stuff as opposed or not? I think that people have caught on about how to talk about the world in an interesting way. Like, science sounds so scary and so formal. It's not. It's like, my whole job is to just look around the world, look at the world around me and ask questions about how it works. And then almost everybody I talk to wants to know about the world around them, just like you two. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to be interested in the world. And so I think people want to know more. They want to connect and experience a place at all its depths, and not just have a kind of superficial surface interaction. There's so many more layers of interesting connection that you can have with a place. And I think people are psyched on that. And I think it's about effective communication about how, like, what's going on, and not getting stuck in science jargon, and not trying to sound smart or cool, but just talking about the world. And I think people are really receptive to that.
Yeah, I keep bumping up against that because I'm just so hungry to learn more, and there are limits to the resources. To be out there with a field guide and you're looking, I was about to say scrolling. You're scrolling through the pages of your print field guide, or you're going through Seek, which is constantly telling you it's a dicot, or maybe every once in a while a monocot. And, or it's misidentifying. And my poor friend, so I'm always leaning on, like, what is this? What is that species? And so, but I one of the things that really changed for me during COVID was feeling like, I had to stay close to home, and I still wanted stimulation, and just learning more about the ecosystem where I live, the desert, the coastal sage chaparral, learning how those things fit together. And I'd always been interested, but I feel like the resources are there for us, maybe especially technologically, that they weren't previously. And, my experience, I'm guessing, is probably pretty common, which is that the more I understand about the way things fit together where I live and where I visit, the more I feel at home there. And also the more that I want to protect it. And I've spent most of my life and career like trying to go fast through things, on a bike or skis or whatever. And I can still do that, but I have a greater understanding. And I got to believe that, especially through the Science Moab program, even like the guides themselves must feel so much more connected to where they're working and playing and the stories they're sharing.
100%. Those are the most fun things I do with my time, because the guides are psyched, they're hungry, they are so excited by the world around them, and it's just, they're so receptive to learning more, and it's a joy.
Well, it connects us, right? I mean, that's one of the really cool things about biological soil, biossoil, is that it is this connected community, right? It is literally physically, now I'm doing the hand thing that you can't see. It is, these filaments, like, have you ever seen it? Like these tiny little filaments that are these little strings that hold it together. And I mean, it's literal, it's figurative, it's metaphorical. Like, there's just so much there. And I think that we all feel that when we understand how the desert is connected by this stuff, and we're connected by that knowledge of it. So
we all feel like little cyanobacteria, each one of us.
Exactly. I want that little sun protection. Mm-hmm. So, well, Kristina Young, Dr. Young, thank you so much for your time and also for your work. I mean, I'm so glad we got to talk about this. Before we piece out here, can you give us we'll put all this in the show notes, but where people want to learn more about this stuff, where they should go?
Totally, yeah. Check out Science Moab. We have a lot of different types of resources that people can check out and learn more about this place. We have live events, so if you're ever coming through Moab, definitely come and see if we're having any kind of fun sciencey thing happening. And just when you're here, when you're out, just like lean down and look at the soil. Get really close and just try not to face plant, but get really close and look and appreciate Biocrust, and be a part of the solution of protecting it.
Yeah, the thumbnail for the film, at least the last one I've seen, is you and John Watson on your hands and knees with your noses in the dirt. It's great.
How you can find me most of the time.
When are you going to have merch? I keep looking for like a Science Moab trucker hat to buy, and you don't have merch up on the site right now, do you?
Don't have it on the site, but we have it, so I'll make sure to get you a cool hat.
Okay, I want to buy. I want to support. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank everybody for listening all the way through. Do check out Science Moab. Follow on the gram. Same with AJ. And we will catch you next time.
See ya.